Good morning, and thank you for joining us for another episode in the museum's Facebook Live series. I'm your host, historian Edna Friedberg. Holocaust history offers countless examples of the roles that ordinary people assumed during this dark chapter in the human experience. We hope that it leads you to think critically about your own place, your own power in shaping society, and to become alert to the ways that we are all vulnerable to dangerous ideas. We are living at a time of great unrest and rising extremism. Hate crimes are spiking, anti-Semitism and other forms of racism abound, and extremist groups that were once on the fringes are inching their way into the mainstream. Their threats and actions can wreak havoc and terror on all of us. Just last week, we witnessed some violent extremists storm the United States Capitol. They desecrated a symbol of American democracy, and their actions resulted in the deaths of 5 people, including a United States Capitol police officer. We mourn the loss of his life. Among the rioters were those displaying neo-Nazi, anti-Semitic, and white supremacist symbols, some even glorifying the crimes of the Holocaust. The attack was an affront to all who cherish democracy and to those who work every day to advance the freedom and dignity of all people. Our guest today will help us to understand how anger, fear, and other motivations historically have driven people to join extremist movements such as the Nazi Party, and how they continue to attract people to violence and extremism today. I'd like to welcome our guests. First, Dr. Arie Kruglanski, who is a terrorism expert and social cognitive psychologist at the University of Maryland, the author of many books and the co-author of a book that came out just last year entitled The Radical's Journey, How German Neo-Nazis Voyaged to the Edge and Back. Arie is also a Holocaust survivor. Welcome, Arie. Good morning.
Good morning. Good to be with you.
And again, happy to have back on the program Dr. Patricia Heberer-Rice, who is a senior historian at the museum. Hi, Patricia.
Hi, Edna. Hi, Arie. It's great to be with you both.
During today's program, please post your questions for Arie and Patricia in the comment section, and we will get to as many of them live in the course of the show as we can. So let's begin with you, Arie. I always like to have a sense of the person behind the work. I think it enriches and deepens our discussion. Before we talk about your psychological studies of extremism, let's turn to a little bit of personal history. I know you were born a Jewish child in Poland in 1939, really auspicious or inauspicious timing at the start of the war. Help us understand how your Holocaust experience may have influenced your work today, examining the forces behind terrorism and other violent movements.
So as you said, Edna, I was born in 1939, the year that the German army invaded Poland and my native city of Lodz. As you said, it's not a very good idea for a Jewish kid to be born at that time and place, but that's what happened. The Germans established a Jewish ghetto immediately after their arrival. This was the first ghetto established in Poland. Here you see me in the ghetto with the Star of David and my 2 aunts, 2 twin aunts, Simone and Diana, who managed to escape from Auschwitz. So that's their great story. But the ghetto housed about 230,000 people at the beginning that were gradually exterminated. The children were sent to concentration camp, the elderly and other people who were not indispensable. At the end, in 1944, only 800 families remained, and these families were a working force that provided services for the German army. My father was a director of a factory that manufactures soles for the shoes of German soldiers. And that's why my family survived. I had to hide all the time because children are not allowed, but somehow, miraculously, we survived, and that's another story. In terms of how it affected my personality, my career, it's difficult to tell because we don't know what would have happened to me if I had not undergone these experiences. But I can tell you that I have a sense that the world can be a dangerous place, and I'm very acutely sensitive to human suffering. I cannot bear to see it. I cannot watch Holocaust films, by the way, and I find it difficult, though it's a duty and I do it, to visit the wonderful Holocaust Museum, your place of work.
Yeah, and I don't want to overemphasize something that we can't test. As you mentioned in a previous conversation we had about this, we don't have a control group of what your life would have been like under other circumstances. So you have worked with many, many violent extremists around the world, ranging from members of ISIS to former Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka, tracing their underlying motivations. Help us to understand what drives people in this mindset, especially in the context of the recent attack on the US Capitol.
So what is interesting is that despite that these instances seem to be extremely different from each other, the Holocaust Nazis, the current neo-Nazis, Islamist terrorists that belong to ISIS, the Sri Lankan Tamil Tigers, there is an underlying dynamic that they all share. And this dynamic can be succinctly explained in terms of three factors, the three N's we call them. The first factor is the need. Human behavior is motivated, so there's always the question, what's the underlying motivation? And here the need is the quest for significance, the quest to matter, to be respected, to have dignity. The second N is the narrative that tells you how to attain dignity. What do you need to do? And usually, in the case of violent extremism, it's identification of some alleged enemy that needs to be fought. It could be the Jews, it could be the immigrants, it could be people of color, it could be the deep state. Whatever the narrative tells you, there is a culprit that is assumed to be responsible for your loss of significance, and therefore it has to be fought. And the third N is the network, a social movement that validates the narrative, that supports the narrative, and that gives out respect for those individuals who implement the dictates of the narrative. So the three N's underlie that dynamic of extremism across its variety of instances. To just mention the mob that stormed the Capitol, these people felt that they are deprived of their significance. The election was stolen from them. They feel that their whiteness is being overridden by people of color, by immigrants, by others. So they felt that they are entitled, in the name of the value of restoring the American greatness, that they are entitled to attack the enemies of America, and that narrative was supported by a social movement. Many people agreed with that, 74 million agreed with them, and that motivated ultimately the assault on the Capitol.
So need, narrative, network. Really fascinating framework to bring in. I'd like to take a moment to pause to acknowledge viewers that we have watching from all around the country and all around the world. Good morning, and thank you for joining us from North Carolina, Virginia, Tennessee, Florida. We are glad to have viewers with us from Wisconsin, Boston, and other cities around the United States. We also welcome quite a number of international viewers. Good morning to you, or good afternoon, actually, depending on where you are, in Peru, in London, in the UK, Cordoba, Argentina, Cologne. We have viewers in France, in Chihuahua and Ruidoso, Mexico, in Toronto, Canada, and people watching from Greece and Colombia. So we are really glad to have you here to join in this conversation. Patricia, I'd like to bring you in as well. And I was thinking when Arie was talking about network, the way that social media today plays an important role in connecting people who otherwise might never have met. It's certainly a vital tool to spread hateful rhetoric, to recruit people, to plan and galvanize, and forms this combustible mixture. Looking back to the Nazis and the way that they drowned out other messages, sold positive, attractive ideas, how did the Nazis accomplish this, particularly with young people?
Right. So beginning, I think, really, Edna, in the 1920s, the Nazi Party, which at that time was still a very small party on the margins of German politics, they specifically targeted propaganda to German youth. Already quite early on, they were really determined to fight for the hearts and minds of young people. And Nazi propaganda characterized the party as dynamic and hopeful. And it was everywhere, in the classroom, in children's books, in extracurricular activities, seeping into virtually every aspect of young Germans' lives. And in many ways, including in its leadership makeup, Nazism was, at the beginning, a very young movement. And at least at the outset, the Nazis made it look meaningful, even fun. And if you see here, you see members of the Hitler Youth engaged in military training, something which was probably very exciting to young boys, at least before the war began in earnest. And youth activities in the Nazi era for Hitler Youth for boys, the League of German Girls for girls. Here you see members of the League of German Girls carrying out rhythmic calisthenics. This all involved Aryan children in camping, sports, music. It gave particularly rural youth, at that time, many parts of Germany was still rural, and it gave rural youth a chance to travel, try new things. So this movement could be quite transformative. And there were uniforms and medals that made young people feel engaged and important. Sometimes they were participating in mass rallies, which reinforces feelings of unity and patriotism. But at the same time, these children are being indoctrinated with virulent anti-Semitism and Nazi ideology that characterizes Jews and other groups as racial enemies. And at first, membership in Nazi youth organizations was voluntary. But by the late 1930s, membership in the Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls became mandatory. And the Nazi leadership, here you see the photograph of a young man looking at the Fuhrer, the ultimate goal to serve the Fuhrer. The Nazi leadership quickly dissolves competing youth organizations like scouting associations and church groups in order to monopolize its influence over German youth. And you see the impact immediately in the numbers. The Hitler Youth, it was about 100,000 members in January of 1933 when the Nazis come to power. And by 1937, that's 5.4 million. So the movement grows very quickly.
Just explosive growth. And looking at that propaganda poster and other similar images, which, by the way, if viewers are interested, we're posting links in the comments to related material and resources in our online Holocaust encyclopedia. But looking at that poster, I'm struck by how Hitler is portrayed as a father figure. You know, he looms large above all others, and remembering how German youth, what we would today call teens and tweens, were encouraged even to denounce their parents, their close family members, their neighbors, if they were seen to be doing forbidden activities. So the way that it played on the need of young people for independence, for rebellion, for some kind of agency. Let's take a listen in a moment to a clip from a man named Peter Feigl. At the time that the war began, Peter, who is a survivor and a volunteer at our museum here in Washington, was a young Jewish boy living in Austria. And when Austria was annexed by Nazi Germany, he too felt the contagious pull of Nazism. Let's hear him describe his experience at that time.
And I went down there and I saw these tens of thousands of people on the street, and all the German flags and the music and the bands and everything else. And I was in there with the mass of the people, shouting my head off like everybody else. Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer. One people, one Reich, and one leader. When I finally got home, my mother was besides herself. She didn't know, where have you been? You've been gone for 6 hours, you know. And I said to her, I saw our Führer. Whereupon my mother slapped me left and right and said, you never call that SOB again our Führer. He is not our Führer. And I guess that's the first time that I came to the realization, wait a minute, somehow I don't fit in, we don't fit into the grandiose schemes of this maniac. But as I said, at 9, I wanted to have a uniform like all the other kids who were joining the Hitlerjugend, and have a little dagger and Sam Brown belt and march to the music and the drums. It all was fascinating and hypnotizing for a young kid.
Patricia, it feels almost incredible to imagine that a Jewish child could be attracted to the appeal of Nazism, right?
Right. But actually, Peter's experience reflects that of many German Jewish youths, particularly those that were very assimilated into German society and German culture. And his words actually remind me of a young Jewish German girl named Elizabeth Bloch, who by coincidence began a diary at age 10 in January 1933, the very month that Hitler comes to power. And she wrote that she always loved to watch these lavish Nazi propaganda spectacles of films by Leni Riefenstahl and begged to be allowed to join the League of German Girls. And in the end, of course, Elizabeth and her family were murdered in the Holocaust.
Yeah, really chilling, but also reminders to us how masterful and psychologically adept this marketing was, because it was a marketing campaign. We have an audience question from a viewer named Marna, asking if we can show the corollaries between Nazi Germany and now. Arie, one of the compelling things about your work is that it allows us to avoid overly simplistic comparisons, but what do the Nazis of the 30s and 40s share in common with present day neo-Nazis? How do they differ?
So this is very interesting. What they share is the 3 N that I mentioned, the need, the narrative, and the network. But they also differed in 2 major respects. The need for significance can be aroused in 2 different ways. One is through a loss of significance, through humiliation, disenfranchisement, bullying, disrespect, discrimination, or by the opportunity to gain tremendous significance. Many of the neo-Nazis of today, a majority, joined the movement because of some loss of significance, some discrimination against them, some bullying, some threat that they felt. The Nazis of yesteryear, the Nazis of Germany, as Patricia so aptly illustrated, and also the story in the video that we've seen, is that what attracted individuals to the Nazi movement was the glory, the gain of significance that they would experience upon joining, the medals, the parades, the touting of them as the flower of the German nation, the future of Germany. So, it was a great attraction. So that was one big difference. It was not the loss of significance, but rather the opportunity for significance gain. The second major difference was that in Germany, the Nazi movement became a majority, a mainstream phenomenon. So there were no alternatives. Most people believed in it. Most people supported it. It was a general wave of enthusiasm for the Nazi ideology, for the Nazi narrative. And that made it very difficult to abandon the movement. And we know that the Hitler Youth were among the most indoctrinated, the most faithful, the most committed fighters in the Second World War. They fought to the last man in the streets of Berlin once it was already known that everything is lost. Now, the neo-Nazis of today are a minority. They are a fringe group. This is changing, unfortunately, but they're still a fringe group. The mainstream society is moderate. So they have many opportunities to meet differently minded people that can pull them away from the movement. And indeed, we know that the neo-Nazis stay in the movement is relatively brief, about 10 years on the average, fewer number of years, because they're pulled by connections with other networks, with other narratives.
So there's competition for their hearts and minds, as the expression goes. We've been talking on a very kind of abstract and theoretical level. I'd like to put individual names and faces and experiences to this theory. Let's look at someone, if you could introduce us to someone who you've come to know very well, an American man named Christian Picciolini. Tell us about his trajectory, please.
So Christian Picciolini, who by now became a good friend and a fellow fighter against extremism, was in his youth a very isolated, bullied Italian boy whose parents moved from an Italian neighborhood to a more upscale neighborhood where he felt discriminated against. He was among the few Italians. He was isolated.
I'm going to interrupt you a second. He was Italian American, right? He was living near Chicago.
Italian American. I keep saying Italian.
It's okay.
His parents were very busy, so he felt abandoned by them as well. And at that point, in his weakness, in his period of depression, he was approached by a neo-Nazi leader who recognized his vulnerability and played to his Italian identity, Italian-American identity, the fact that he was discriminated as of Italian origin, and he emphasized the importance of the Italian culture and promised that in the ranks of the neo-Nazi movement, he will be given the acceptance and the respect that he deserves. And indeed, Christian, who was and still is a very ambitious and able man, joined the movement, and very quickly he rose in the ranks. Here you see him, a leader among the neo-Nazis of those times, and he became a very important person, brutalizing others, beating others up, totally committed to the neo-Nazi ideology, worshipping Hitler, and so on and so forth.
We see here an image of Christian giving the Nazi salute at the site of the former Dachau concentration camp. I know I did a little reading about him last night and saw that he was active in kind of hardcore punk skinhead scene and even fronted a hate rock band called Final Solution that toured in Germany. So his worldview was definitely intertwined with Holocaust denial. Let's put a pause on Christian. We'll return to him in a little bit. But look at someone from the Nazi era. People are sometimes surprised to know that women are also vulnerable to extremist ideologies. It's more common to see the kind of thug-like photo that we just saw of Christian, some kind of tough guy out there, breaking heads. Tell us about a woman from the Nazi era named Paulina Khanisler, please, Patricia.
Right. So Paulina Khanisler is someone who was clearly drawn to Nazism because of her own personal experiences and grievances. She was born in 1900 near Odessa, what is today Ukraine, to wealthy ethnic German parents. Her father owned and managed a large estate in Ukraine, and after the Tsar fell and the Bolshevik Revolution swept the rest of the family, fled for their lives, basically, to Germany. And here they were living in Germany in rather reduced circumstances, no longer in a big villa. Her father had to take a menial job with the railroad. And Paulina had been privately educated with a tutor, all the trappings of wealth, and now her family needed money. So she was trained as a nurse, and she began to work as a nurse in psychiatric facilities, which is kind of, as in the rankings of how nurses operate, this is sort of rather what we would say low on the totem pole. And she had very strong anti-communist feelings, which really ensured that, based on the experiences she had had during the Bolshevik Revolution, this ensured that she would be sympathetic to the Nazi Party, one of whose tenets, of course, was anti-communism. And so she joins the Nazi Party, not very common for women, it's more common for men to join. And she joins in the first year of what we might call open membership in the party in 1937. And so she's really very pro-Nazi for this reason. And her life takes this very significant turn when she's summoned to Berlin, and she's told with other nurses about a new secret government program. It was December of 1939, and she was recruited basically into the Nazis' clandestine program to murder disabled patients in institutions, the so-called euthanasia program, or T4 program, as it's sometimes called. This is the Nazis' first program of mass murder, and it murders about 250,000 German patients in institutions with disabilities.
And Patricia, what do we know specifically about Paulina's decision and thought process in deciding to participate in this plan of mass killing?
Right. It's so, and sometimes, I mean, I think it's easy for our listeners to assume that normal people had to be coerced to participate in mass murder. But we know from Paulina's own words that she was, in fact, recruited. She's given a choice about what to do. She told investigators who arrested her in the post-war, and this is a quote, "I was asked if I wanted to participate. Whoever didn't agree could back out. We didn't feel very good about it." She's talking about herself and her fellow nurses, but I had no more reservations. And nurses originally play a supporting role in the murders, undressing patients and escorting them to the gas chamber. Doctors usually carried out the actual gassings at the time. But by 1942, the mode of killing changes for the euthanasia program. It's the killing of adults is done by lethal overdose, and then it's the nurses, male and female nurses, who did the killing. And so Paulina, and there you see photographs of her and some of the materials collected by post-war investigators when she's arrested in 1945. She worked at 3 separate euthanasia facilities that we know of, and she's believed to have murdered several hundred patients with her own hands. And in the post-war, she exhibited very little remorse for her actions, feeling that she'd contributed through this euthanasia program to remove disabled individuals, useless eaters, if you will, from the German racial community.
And was she punished in any way? How did she live out the rest of her life?
Right, that's very interesting, and basically a model for how other nurses who participated in this crime actually came out in the post-war. She was held in 1945, tried in 1948, and she served about 3.5 years before she goes back to nursing. And she retired in the 1960s with a state pension. So she just returns to her normal life.
So she became a mass serial killer, but she was able to resolve her internal moral conflict in favor of what she thought of as patriotic or even self-defense. Very troubling. Arie, I'd like to turn our attention to it. We have a lot of audience questions coming in. Patricia made reference to Paulina Khanisler's fall through socioeconomic rungs and loss of status. We have a question here from a member of the audience named Molly asking, if the first factor is seeking identity and significance, do you believe that extremists are of a specific socioeconomic or geographical designation, typically?
No, not necessarily, because everybody can be attracted to the glory that a given ideology confers. People like Osama bin Laden, a billionaire, not many well-educated people can be attracted to the possibility of doing something of utmost significance, something that cannot be accomplished by ordinary career, ordinary working life, becoming a hero, a martyr, a superstar. That's what extremism promises, and I think that can be attractive to people from all walks of society. The case of Paulina is interesting because she was an ambitious woman who felt deprived of significance by the Bolsheviks, as Patricia was explaining to us, and that gave the impetus to her desire to restore her significance. So yes, Patricia is right. You don't need to be coerced. The power of this motivation is such that it suppresses everything else. And in the service of this motivation, you're willing to do what the narrative tells you you must.
So along that line, our viewers may be surprised to learn that eventually Christian Picciolini, who you introduced us to earlier, hardcore skinhead, not only rejected white supremacy, but in fact has made it its life mission to help people resist the pull of such hate groups. Tell us about that and how it came to be.
There are two aspects of it. Why did he leave the neo-Nazi movement, and what happened to him thereafter? As I explained, in the current American scene, the neo-Nazis are a minority, are a fringe group. So it's very easy for a neo-Nazi to meet others who are of a different mindset. And Christian opened, just to earn a livelihood, to open a music store, a record store, whose clients were a variety of people, Jewish people, people of color, others, and he befriended them. He discovered their humanity. He discovered the fact that they are not the monsters that were painted out to be in the narrative. And that caused a change of mind. His wife was a different mindset. She left him with their 2 children. And so his contact with this network occasioned the shift away from the narrative. He was realizing that there are other ways of looking at life and the world, and that the basic neo-Nazi ideology is invalid and wrong and unjust. The second part of it is that Christian Picciolini, as a young child and throughout his life, was a very ambitious person. He wanted to make a difference in the world. He dreamed of being an important person, making a contribution. Once the neo-Nazi membership was taken away from him, he found another calling in fighting the movement. And he has been on the forefront of that attempt, that enterprise in our society. He established a framework that is called Free Radicals, and he's working here. You see him with a neo-Nazi trying to pull him away from the movement, and he's doing it at his own expense, at his own time, in an one-on-one situation, and he's doing a very blessed work, again, in order to feel that he's making a difference, that he's gaining significance and respect, doing something constructive.
So it's really fascinating. It's not as though someone like Christian has undergone a personality transplant. His core essence, if I'm hearing you correctly, is still the same. He's still charismatic. He still is a leader. He's still someone with thinking about wider society, but he's channeling it in service of a very different cause. Is that right?
Different narrative, exactly.
We have a related question. Many audience questions are coming in from people who want to know how to confront or influence people who may hold hateful or extremist views. Here's a slightly more nuanced question coming from a viewer named Amy, who actually says she's a former student of yours, Professor Kruglanski. She asks if you have any suggestions for how to, and she puts in quote, deprogram friends or family who may not participate in the most violent aspects of domestic terrorism, but who identify with the terrorist goals or political objectives. What would you say to someone like Amy?
I would say recognize the motivational aspect. What is it that is driving them? Recognize their pain, recognize their frustration, and address alternative ways of dealing with that frustration. Explaining that the way of confrontation, the way of violence is only going to tear our society apart. That to be vindictive and to engage in conflict and destruction is not going to bring peace, and it's not going to restore justice to our society. So on the one hand, recognize that they have a pain, they have a suffering that is real and maybe was caused by injustice. Do not deny that, but there's a different way of addressing it that is salutary as opposed to detrimental to building a just and fair society.
And I don't hear you saying at all making excuses, but that if we just kind of write people off as unrelatable, nothing is valid about what they're doing, you can't even have a conversation, right?
Exactly. That's going to just polarize society into two warring camps, and no good can come of that. Vindictiveness and conflict is going to just tear our society asunder.
In the few minutes that we have left, I want to ask each of you a kind of bigger picture, what is the meaning of this for you type question. Patricia, we know, we can see in very stark terms every time we turn on our phones or listen to the radio that extremism is a global phenomenon. How do you think, as a historian, that we can apply the lessons, the messages from Holocaust history in order to mitigate the power of these appeals.
Right. As Arie said several times, of course, Nazism and modern extremist movements are not directly comparable for all the reasons he's explained very carefully. But there are, as he said, these very common threads and common roots. So learning about the Holocaust can help to arrest the cycle of violence, I hope. The Holocaust teaches us just where the power of prejudice can lead us. It can be, as we see and have seen in history, it can be very lethal, extremely lethal. It teaches us that democracies are fragile things, even democracies as old and venerable as ours, and how important it is to protect our democratic values and infrastructure. And I think the Holocaust also teaches us something that Arie said again and again in this discussion today, and that's so important, and that's that we can't demonize extremists or see them as monsters. It's important to understand that many people who committed crimes during the Holocaust or engage in extremist violence today are at root people just like us, whom an ideology has convinced them that what they're doing is right. And until we understand that, what motivates them, we can't understand the history or our fellow Americans who harbor extremist sentiments.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, Patricia, you don't get off the hook that easily. We have so many questions coming in from viewers that we're going to run a little bit longer. I want to pose to you, Patricia, a question that's come in from Ryan. He's wondering about the Hitler Youth that survived through the end of the war. How were they brought back into society and deprogrammed to not be radically motivated anymore, or were they?
Right. So the Hitler Youth, people who grew up with the Hitler Youth are, as Arie said, some of the most indoctrinated individuals in German society after Nazism comes to a halt, because they spent all those years being indoctrinated as youths. And they do, when they're pulled into the military in the last days of the war, they are the most determined fighters, even for this losing cause. The Hitler Youth, it was not illegal to be in the Hitler Youth because it was compulsory by the late 1930s, as we've stated. But what really kind of deprograms, and it doesn't deprogram everyone. There were still people in the 1950s. There are still people in Germany today that harbor extremist ideas. But the most, perhaps most efficacious way of deprogramming these people was the horrible circumstances in which Germany found itself at the end of World War II, with just unconditional surrender. The whole infrastructure was stripped. People were starving. The whole infrastructure really collapses at the end of World War II with a power vacuum, and is occupied by the Allies. And Germany is just exhausted with fighting. And it's striking to see how quickly the German public adapts to, especially West Germany adapts to becoming a new power, democratic power, NATO ally of the United States and Western Europe. And I think it's that firestorm of destruction at the end of World War II. And of course, the horrible crimes that were attributed rightly to Germany that made people sit back and think, what have we done? And of course, some people really did feel that. So I think that was the most defective deprogramming.
I wanted to add to that. There are two forces in German society. One is the horror at what happened to Germany as a consequence of the Nazi movement of the Third Reich. But on the other hand, there has been a continuity of Nazism in Germany. Many of the people who are major figures in the SS and the NSA remained in powerful positions in the post-war German society. And many of them continued to support the Nazi movement, support the same ideas. There were thousands of plots ranging from smearing synagogues to assassinations and to attacks on minorities and others. And so until in the year 2000, the German Chancellor Helmut Schroeder announced the rebellion of the dissent and provided tremendous funds for German counter-violent extremist effort. So the German society has been struggling. Recently, the refugee crisis of 2015 infused the neo-Nazi elements with added enthusiasm, and the Alternative for Deutschland party is now in the Bundestag. So Germany is grappling with these two forces. On the one hand, the great democratic reaction, great humanitarian reaction. The Chancellor Merkel is demonstrating and representing that. On the other hand, the aftermath of the Second World War, the continuity of the Nazi elements, and the possibility that it can be rekindled.
And it's not unique to Germany. All of the forces and trends that you're describing, we see the rise, and often fed by World War II era history, myths, and rewriting of that history across Europe. We see it in Hungary, we see it in Poland, France. I actually cannot think of a country in Europe that is not suffering from these same convulsions. Arie, what do you hope that our viewers will take from the insights that you've shared with us today into their lives? And particularly, we have audience members, a woman like Dawn is asking, well, how do we deal with this in the world of social media where misinformation is so readily available and amplified? What can the average person do with this new understanding you've offered?
Well, I think, first of all, it's important to distinguish between the moral disapproval, the moral opprobrium we feel with respect to the deeds of the neo-Nazis and the far right, assault on the Capitol and other things, and understanding the psychology that animates that people. Merely disapproving of them is not going to solve the problem. We have to understand the psychology that makes it happen. Understand that there is a real fear, a real suffering, real pain, and that pain is addressed inappropriately, and that has to change. The media, you asked earlier about the role of the media. The problem with the media is that they multiply the narrative, they multiply the virulent, the negative narrative, and it has to be countered by a positive narrative. We must keep on discussing and talking to people of a different mind, living with differences and negotiating with them what is the right way to build our society, rather than relegating them to the status of evil monsters that cannot be negotiated, that cannot be rationalized, that cannot be discussed with. So I think we've got to come together, cool the rhetoric, and engage in a constructive effort to rebuild our society, to increase the tolerance. And this is something that has to happen on the level of the whole society, at the level of communities, at the level of schools, at the level of social institutions, the churches, religious institutions, the police. We all have to understand the dynamics of extremism and fight it on all those levels.
Powerful words, not easy to follow necessarily, but critical. I'm thinking even on a platform where we are now, like Facebook, not silencing voices that make us uncomfortable always. I'm not talking about overt hate speech, but being willing to remain friends with that, old high school buddy who holds a different political view, following media sources that don't necessarily just leave us in an echo chamber of our own world framework. That will help us, I hope. So I want to thank you, Arie and Patricia, so much for joining us today to discuss the unchanging currents of human nature, how people are susceptible to them, and why they may decide to join extremist groups. Thank you to you both.
Thank you. Thank you, Patricia. Thank you, Edna.
Thank you, Arie. Thank you, Edna. It was great to be with you today.
Indeed.
I'm reminded always that in my time as a Holocaust historian, and I might know my colleagues feel the same way, it's actually much more disturbing to realize that the people, Germans and their collaborators who committed these crimes, were not monsters. The more they are relatable, the more it is disturbing, but that is the complex truth of it, that the human need to belong and feel important and valued is undeniable, and that it's up to each of us to determine how we go about fulfilling that need. So I hope that this conversation has given you some food for thought and complicated your thinking about why people make the choices that they do. We invite you to join us for our next program in 2 weeks on International Holocaust Remembrance Day, Wednesday, January 27th, same time, 9:30 a.m. here in the Eastern United States, for a program where our guest will be Susan Eisenhower, author of the book How Ike Led. Susan's grandfather was Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander of forces in Europe during World War II, later the American president. And Eisenhower, he was forever changed by what he saw firsthand at the newly liberated Ohrdruf concentration camp in April 1945. Even as Allied forces continued their fight in the last weeks of the war, Eisenhower foresaw a day when the horrors of the Holocaust might be denied, and his work to ensure the full scale of Nazi crimes was documented helped to preserve the true historical record. We hope to see you then. Until then, be safe and healthy wherever you are. Bye-bye.